This program, part 2 of 2 on the Exodus story and modern archaeology, is copyright 2021 by Pastor Richard A. Mathisen. Okay, welcome back. I had ended where we were talking about the mysterious hill country people and where they came from, and there were 3 theories, which were the Canaanite urban escapee theory, the Canaanite pastoral nomad theory, or the persons outside of Israel, which could well be from the Nile Delta. And the question is, what do all 3 theories have in common as far as those mysterious hill country people of 1100 BC? And they have one interesting thing in common, which is, I say, the Exodus event. I'm defining the Exodus event as being sudden deliverance of the Israelites from Egyptian oppression by extraordinary occurrences. Okay? Now, what is interesting is all 3 groups, wherever the mysterious hill country people came from, all 3 groups have in common, they did have a sudden deliverance of the Israelites from Egyptian oppression by extraordinary occurrences. Now, the ones that came from the Nile Delta, it happened in Egypt, right? The extraordinary events, whatever they were, whether it was 10 plagues or crossing the Red Sea or Reed Sea on dry land, whatever happened in Egypt was extraordinary that got them out of Egypt. But the other 2 groups, the Canaanite urban escapees, also have been delivered from Egyptian oppression. First by going up, and then suddenly Egypt is gone. And the same thing for the pastoral nomads. They went and settled in the hill country, the mysterious hill country, and they settled there. It was terrible land, right? All the good land is down in the green areas, but they settled there because of the Egyptians, and now the Egyptians are gone. So all of the mysterious hill country people have in common that they had the sudden deliverance of these proto-Israelites from Egyptian oppression by extraordinary occurrences. Some of the extraordinary occurrences were in Egypt and some were in Canaan, especially when the Egyptians pulled out of Canaan. So there's a lot going on that unites the mysterious hill country people. And in fact, what gets written down is an Exodus story about the sudden deliverance of the Israelites from Egyptian oppression by extraordinary occurrences. But it could have happened in different ways. I'm just going through the 3 groups here. What all hill country people, the proto-Israelites, had in common was a sudden deliverance from Egyptian oppression due to extraordinary occurrences, or so it could be suggested. And I also mentioned we don't know what even the remaining Canaanites, the lowland people after the Egyptians pull out, we don't know what they were thinking. We don't have any records. And what did they think? To have a whole bunch of Philistines come in and take away 5 of their cities and bring in all their pigs in a totally different culture, and then eventually start to expand. And the Philistines had been serving as mercenaries, as enforcers for the Egyptians. And even what do the Canaanites think about the people up in the hill country? We just don't know. I would suggest the Canaanites were not well disposed to the Philistines. And so I think they would join with the hill country people in uniting against the Philistines. That's theory. I don't have any basis for that other than human nature. If the Philistines are so different with all their pig culture and their willingness to work for the Egyptians. Anyway, there's a lot we don't know here, but I wanted to just mention that. Okay, the next section we're going to do 3 category definitions. And they are, what is modern archaeology, what is history, and what's the difference between religious history and secular history. And after each one, I'll stop for questions. Okay, modern archaeology uses 2 techniques, excavation and surface surveys. I think you well, here is a tell. That's an ancient city. The remains of an ancient city, because what happened in the ancient world, everything is built out of mud bricks. They put a layer and then they build the next layer on top of it, so they have one layer after another, and finally you wind up with a mound. And here's another example. That's a large mound of a city that's made up of many, they're called strata. And excavation is very tedious work. You work in several meter square areas, and
paintbrush.
You have to record all the information very carefully, and there's many layers or strata. So whenever you're talking about excavations, you might want to say the city of Megiddo and what is in stratum 17 or what is in stratum 11, you know, because there's all these layers. Remember, Israel has an absolutely crazy history. And all of these things, you know, there's Canaanites with Philistines on top of it, and Egyptians, and then Israelites, and then Assyrians, and then Babylonians, and then Greeks, and Romans. Just so many layers to the archaeology. But the other major technique is called surface surveys, and they look across a broad area, and that's what that looks like. People are actually spreading out. I mean, when we see it in the news, it's usually they're looking for evidence of a crime or the parts of an airplane or something like that. But they began to do the surface surveys in the hill country in the 1970s. And it was those surface surveys that discovered the presence of the mysterious hill country people. Before that, all of the attention had been on those lowlands, because that's where the cities were, that's where the mounds were. They'd been working on those mounds. So it was the 70s, the hill country became accessible to archaeologists, and the surface surveys discovered the existence of the Proto-Israelites, who were the mysterious hill country people. And the final thing about modern archaeology is the assumptions. The assumption for a long time was that the Bible was a good source, authoritative source even, and everything was devoted to saying the Bible is correct or not correct, but it was all based around the Bible. In modern archaeology, the assumption is the opposite. The archaeology is the main source, and then they start comparing that to the Bible or other documents to see whether they're consistent. Now, whether that's good or bad, that's a very major change in the assumptions of archaeology. Any questions about modern archaeology?
Just a point of view. One of the reasons it becomes possible in the 1970s and so forth is that they develop a kind of X-ray kind of thing, and they can essentially take pictures of what it's like underneath without having to dig, so they can go over larger areas.
There's a lot of those sensing techniques
yes.
to find things that are underground. Actually, the real reason it started in the 1970s, and I don't understand this, but it had to do with the 1967 Six-Day War,
Okay.
because the control of the hill country went from the Jordanian government
Mhm.
to the Israeli government. And then the Israeli government was much more tuned in to the archaeology. And I don't fully understand that, but that was when it opened up, and that had an impact. We didn't even know about the mysterious hill country people. Okay? What is history versus prehistory? And I'm going to say history requires a written language and a dependable chronology. A definition of history, correct interpretation of the past to guide the present and prepare for the future. That's not original. I think it goes back to Machiavelli, but history requires a written language and a dependable chronology. When those two exist, we have history, and when they don't, we have what we would call prehistory. And of course, the point is that the pertinent time period is prehistory. We don't have a written language during that period, and we don't have a dependable chronology. And you can compare that to the time period after about 1000, the foundation of the nation-state of Israel, because that period can be considered history. Okay, we have written language, but we also have dependable chronology. And I'll give you an example here, which has to do with the Khirbet Qeiyafa, the event, what finally proved that there was an Israel in 1000. What was the new evidence? The main evidence came from an archaeological site called Khirbet Qeiyafa, and also the evidence about an Egyptian pharaoh called Shoshenq. And we're going to take them one at a time. The recent archaeological evidence is Khirbet Qeiyafa. It's a fortress, and I'll show it to you, built on the border between ancient Israel and Philistia. And that's a reconstruction of it. But this excavation started in 2008 and really became public about 2012 or 15. And the fact that there is a fort out in the middle of nowhere on the border, in Israel, but on the border with the Philistines. Somebody had to organize a lot of labor to put a fort there. And that's how they are now sure that there was a nation state. Now the other piece was about Pharaoh Shoshenq. And in fact, I have a picture of him there. That's Pharaoh Shoshenq. And after 1000, we know there was King David, according to the Bible, King David for 40 years, King Solomon for 40 years. And then 5 years after the death of King Solomon, the Bible says there was an invasion by Pharaoh Shoshenq. And we don't know that the 40-year periods are exact. 40 years occurs far too often. Some people think it's just a long time or something like that.
Yeah.
But Pharaoh Shoshenq can be dated. That invasion of Israel was 925. So if you take the 925 and add on 240s, you're right back to about 1010 BC. You're right back in the area, the time period. So history requires written language and a good chronology, and those things all fit together. I give you the First Kings reference. And so a summary of this category: history requires a written language with a dependable chronology, but the pertinent time period is prehistory and not history, because they didn't have a language. The cuneiform had collapsed, and the Phoenician alphabet was being invented up to the north, and maybe it got to Israel by 1000 BC. Because it was 1050 was when the Phoenicians really stabilized the Phoenician alphabet. You look like you have a question. Okay. So that's, any questions about this definition of history and prehistory? And if not, I go on, this is the one we're leading up to. What's the difference between religious history and secular history? And the difference is, religious history allows for the impact of a higher power. And secular history does not allow for the impact of a higher power. Those are two very different ways of looking at the world. And what I am saying is that religious history can be good history if it's a written history with a dependable chronology. So we can talk about the nation of Israel, or that there was a King David, and there's other evidence outside the Bible of King David. But all history from the very beginning was religious history until about the Enlightenment period in the 18th century. Until then, almost all history assumed the possible impact of a higher power. And here is my little timeline of civilization for Bible purposes. But starting with 3000 BC, all of those ancient Sumerian, Babylonian, Egyptian civilizations were very religious. And all the way up, certainly Western civilization was very religious for the 1,000 years that Christianity was the dominant religion. So, all history from 5000 BC up to about 1800, that's 95% of human history was religious history. Secular history is a very new concept. And for 95% of human history, all cultures were very religious. And I'm talking about the Egyptians, Hittite, Syrian, Babylonian, Roman Empire was very religious. And secular history is a new concept. Today we evaluate the Exodus story according to modern secular standards of history, which is right and proper for that purpose. But for 95% of human history, it was unthinkable to talk about, there's no higher power influencing things. And for the scribes of ancient Israel in particular, secular history was unthinkable. Their history was a theological statement, monotheistic theological interpretation of the pertinent time period. That doesn't mean it couldn't have been correct. It just means the way of thinking about it is very different. So what is the difference? Religious history allows for the impact of a higher power. Secular does not. And any questions? I'm just setting this up to try, because I'm going to be raising some of these questions in the last part of the lecture. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the mysterious hill country people in detail. And this was originally quite a bit longer, but I think the mysterious hill country people are truly fascinating people. And leave aside the question of whether they came from Canaan or out of Egypt, led by Moses. Just leaving that aside, we're looking at who they were and their lifestyle in the hill country of Canaan. They were destined to have a huge impact on the history of Western civilization, right? They could be credited with monotheism, Western morality, and the mother of all freedom stories. And they can also be credited with that morality in both Judaism and Christianity, first century, being love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? This is a group of people that laid down the grid, the format, for everything in our civilization. And and that's an achievement that is just monumental, and it's very hard for me to get my mind around, because that's not the way it gets taught in school. You know, if you say, oh, yeah, the Exodus story is the foundation of the modern world, people would probably say, nah. Well, you just have to look at the evidence, that's all. But the most fascinating aspect to me is their egalitarianism. And it might be related to the other things. Who were they? They were people living in farmhouses up in this remote and inaccessible hill country, because there's all this brush, there's no roads, you know. They are pioneers. I mean, the closest comparison I can make is to the Western pioneers in their log cabins, you know. They're out in the middle of nowhere, no support, nobody to call on except the people around them. And every person has their own house in the hill country, you know, and so you have 30 or 40 farmhouses on a 1 acre plot, and no walls, because they're so far out of the mainstream. You know, these are pioneers. And you know, anything about pioneer culture, women are very important. They're not, you know, whatever else you may think about the customs. This is, everybody is working their fingers off because they've got to try to make a living, a farming living, in a very inhospitable domain. But, so we had egalitarianism. The Egyptians, Philistines, and Canaanites lived in stratified societies. Rich people in palaces, poor people in hovels, and the hill country people were the exact opposite. No palaces, no fancy pottery, no cities, no temples. Everybody was equal. They were forced to look out for each other. Nobody protected them. And we know later on, right, the Israelite prophets constantly stressed social justice issues, the treatment of widows and orphans, the treatment of the poor. And by the 1st century AD, we find Judaic morality stressing the need to love your neighbor as yourself, as did the Christians. Let's start with their houses. To me, it's probably the most fascinating thing. During the monarchy, this is from 1000 all the way to the Babylonian exile, 586, 400 years of monarchy, right, in Israel. The split of the northern kingdom and southern kingdom, and then the southern kingdom continued till the Babylonian exile. The Israelites lived in a type of house called the Israelite 4-room house. That's what it's called in archaeology. And what happened in the when the mysterious hill country people were discovered is they already knew about this 4-room house. And they find that the mysterious hill country people are living in 4-room houses. First of all, that's how they know immediately these are the people that are going to found the state of Israel. But it also means that what they always thought was a city house in the cities of Israel was originally a farmhouse. And this 4-room house seems to be very adapted to the hill country with the sloping terrain or whatever, but anyway, it was a farmhouse, and I'm going to show you one now. I wish this mouse obeyed me. Okay. This is an Israelite 4-room house. And what you have is the door down here, the entrance, and on the back you've got this wide room, and then here you've got 2, 3 rooms. So those are the 4 rooms. But what people didn't realize originally is that this one is not covered. It's a courtyard. Some people call it a pillar courtyard house, because it's got these pillars that are often even solid stone. And at first they didn't know why they were so solid, and then they finally realized that there's a second story. So here's another example, and now you can see the second story. And again, the door here, the courtyard, one room, and then a back room, and then this is the living area up on top of that back room. So it's called the Israelite four-room house, but that was the way, that was the structure, the architecture that they used. Hill country was very difficult to farm. Water was in short supply. Almost the entire year's water came in, I think, 2 months. I wanted to check December and January, something like that. You know, torrential rains and then drought the rest of the time. So they had to develop these cisterns they were lined with lime, you know, so it holds water, and they would have these huge underground cisterns. They also had underground silos to store their grain in, and they had terracing. There's a terrace. You know, that helps because when the rain comes, the terrace retains as much water as possible. They had food taboos. The hill country people avoided pork, and the Canaanites in general ate very little pork. Whereas for the Philistines, pork was a big food. They come from a Greek culture, right? Greek area, Aegean Sea, where hearths are the big thing. You know, all of the big houses have a hearth, like 3-foot wide hearth for a big fire, over which you roast a pig. You know, so you get a whole bunch of people together and you're roasting a pig, and you'll find the Philistine areas, the 5 cities, have a lot of these hearths. And that's part of their culture, but very different from the Canaanite even, and then definitely. Okay, pottery. Hill country pottery was very plain and utilitarian, and it was very different from the Philistine and Canaanite pottery. I have an example here. On the left is the Philistine pottery, highly decorated, and some of it's much more decorated than that, and the Israelite, which is very plain. Religious information. Now, here the weird thing is we don't know much about their religion. You know, it's strange because that's what many people are interested in. But they don't, all of the Canaanites and Philistines and Egyptians have temples in their cities. That's where they worship. There is no religious structure in the hill country. There is no temple of any sort. And there's also a lot of religion is dependent on investigating tombs. And the Canaanites have tombs, and the Philistines have tombs, and the Egyptians have impressive tombs. The pyramids, you know, were a tomb. And they have yet to discover, they still think, well, there must be some out there. But whatever it was the Israelites were doing, it was different from everybody else. We know it was different. There's no doubt about that. What it was, we don't know. They do find little statues of some of the Canaanite gods, but you would not be surprised from the Bible to find that there are a number of household-type gods. But the interesting thing is there's very little knowledge we have about the religion, except that it was different. Any questions about the mysterious hill country people? Okay, Egyptians and Philistines in detail. We know the Egyptian empire collapsed in 75 years, and it was attacked by the Philistines in 1177, and that led to the Philistine settlement in Canaan and the Philistine warriors being used as mercenaries. But the collapse. During the collapse, Israel had 2 strong pharaohs and a whole bunch of weak pharaohs. And the two strong pharaohs were called Merneptah and Ramesses III. Merneptah was 1213 to 1203, and Ramesses III was 1185 to 1154. And he was assassinated in 1154, which we're going to talk about. Assassinated by the harem conspiracy.
Mhm.
So here are the strong pharaohs, and what you see is it goes strong pharaoh and then a whole bunch of weak pharaohs, 6 of them, and then another strong pharaoh and another whole bunch of weak pharaohs. And the weak pharaohs, we don't necessarily know exactly what's happening, but there just seems to be a lot of anarchy or power struggles, and eventually what starts happening is the temples, the Egyptian temples are gaining more and more power, and they become almost a separate power center, which hurts the Egyptians, because it used to be the king was the sole power center. Here is Pharaoh Merneptah, and in 1208 he is invaded. 1208 is the start of our time period, right? And it's also when we have a statement about the Israelites. In 1208, this pharaoh got attacked by Libya, the king of Libya, which is the country to the west of it. And that king was aided by a bunch of sea peoples. These are the pirate ships that are set loose because you're starting to have all of this anarchy and chaos. They attacked Egypt. Merneptah defeated them, and he made a monument. This is called the Merneptah Stele of 1208. It's 10 feet tall. I don't know if you can tell that. You know, it's a huge, with a whole bunch of writing about boasting about his defeat of the Libyans. And then he had some Canaanite cities that were acting up, you know, so he went in and cleaned out the cities. And then he had this other group, because the Canaanite cities are specified as being organized. And then he had another group of troublemakers who were up in the hill country, and he went and cleaned them out. Now we know at that time there were already 28 little settlements, so he probably went after one of them or something. But that mention of this group called Israel in 1208 is an anchor to our whole time period. We know, because the pharaohs knew everything. You know, they had spies throughout the land of Canaan. And we have, in fact, the Amarna letters, which are correspondence between the pharaohs and all the Canaanite cities. And they're all pointing fingers at each other and saying, oh, the Megiddo people are doing this, or the Jerusalem people are doing, you know, they're all finger pointing, but Egypt is sitting there with the iron fist and controlling everything. So Merneptah Stele defeated the Libyans, and he defeated the, quote, group called Israel, an unorganized group. Ramesses III is the other strong pharaoh, and you can see he's 1186 to 1154. But he was the one, at the time, the Philistines and the other sea peoples. And so he wrote lengthy things on the walls of his temple, illustrated. You can see that illustration there, right? That's from the wall of the temple. And he defeated the Philistines, and he settled them in Canaan and used them as mercenaries. He was assassinated in 1154 by the harem conspiracy. And then there were the weak pharaohs. And there were two periods of weak pharaohs, one following Merneptah, one following Ramesses III. And they may be related to the Exodus story for this reason, because a period of weakness is when slaves in Egypt would find it easier to get away. And in fact, the Bible has an interesting verse. This is King James. And it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of bondage, and they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. That's the start of the Exodus story. But it refers to the death of a king. Whether that has any applicability, we don't know for sure, but it is the period of weakness. These two periods of weakness both follow the death of a strong king. So we had the strong pharaohs, Merneptah and Ramesses III, and the weak ones in between, so it's going back and forth like that. Now we're going to shift to the Philistines and other sea people. The Philistines were one of 6 groups that invaded Egypt in 1177. And if I tried to cover all of them, you're probably overloaded already. But because the Philistines are the only one that makes any difference in Canaan. Because they brought in 25,000 people, and they became a dominant force there. But there was this attack going on coming from the sea peoples up in the Aegean area, and they are going through Cyprus and Cilicia, which is that corner, and then you have Syria, Ugarit, and they're coming down through Canaan and then down to Egypt to attack. And there's the map where you can see these are that's Greek and that's Crete, and this is the Aegean. And they're coming, there's the Luca, that's Cyprus, they attack there. This is Cilicia, there's Ugarit in Syria. These are the Phoenicians, and then this is Canaan. It's interesting that it seems like the sea people attacked almost everybody except the Phoenicians. Now, what that means, we don't know. There are theories that maybe the Phoenicians had friendships or whatever. But here is a picture of the sea peoples. This is a book. That's the guy on the left is the Philistine with that feathered headdress, and the one on the right is a cherub with the horned helmet. Those were 2 of the groups of the sea peoples. And it's an interesting book because they've hired an artist. They were using the paintings, the wall paintings on the Egyptian temples, which had pictures of these characters. But they've used an artist to make it look much more modern and lively. And I'm going to quote what Ramesses III said about the Philistines, okay? The people of the sea, that's the sea peoples, plotted in their islands and attacked. They were unstoppable and full of zeal. But I prepared well and laid a trap for them, and they were caught like a bird in a trap on the Nile Delta and badly defeated. Then later in another place he says, then of those who were not killed, I took them as captive and brought them to Egypt, and I settled them in strongholds bound in my name. In other words, he made them mercenaries. Of course, later on, he was assassinated in 1154 by the Harem conspiracy. It's very odd because we have not that many documents. We have a whole bunch of documents about the trial of the Harem conspiracy, because these were all when you have a harem, you have the first wife and the second wife, and then you have all the other concubines or whatever. This was the second wife conspiring against the first wife because she wanted her son to be the next pharaoh instead of the son of the first wife. But it's documented. They have testimony, from the trial, the Egyptian trial. This is back in 1154. And part of it is that there was obviously a well-organized conspiracy because the country was falling apart. And there were strikes of workers, the ones that built the tombs, they were going on strike. There was drought. Everything was in a mess, and that was part of the reason for the conspiracy. And it was after that that Egypt fell apart, and only about 20 years later, they just pulled all of their troops out of Canaan, and that left the power vacuum we were talking about. Questions about the Egyptians and Philistines? Okay, so what really did happen with the Exodus story? And there are three possible answers about the Exodus event. The maximalist answer, it happened exactly the way the Bible said. The standard archaeological answer, which they are very skeptical about the occurrence of a large number of people leaving Egypt, but they can't prove it didn't happen. And so that's I don't know to what extent that's bias, or because there's obviously a huge inflow into the hill country area from somewhere, from some unknown source or sources. But then there's Richard. Well, there's a third position here, which is if we define Exodus event as sudden deliverance of the Israelites from Egyptian oppression due to extraordinary occurrences, you can say that all of the mysterious hill country people, no matter where they were from, the Canaanite cities, the pastoral nomads, or from the Nile Delta, all of them had the experience of a sudden freedom from Egyptian oppression. And by the time the story gets written down, it's some 250 years later. And who knows what has happened. It is true that both of those two archaeological theories, the Canaanite urban escapees, Canaanite pastoral nomads, both of those, the people agree, well, there probably were some people from the Nile Delta. There almost had to be, But what the percentage is, nobody knows, and archaeology argues among itself. Within archaeology, there's no agreement on where the mysterious hill country people came from. That would be saying an exodus did occur, but not necessarily exactly the way the Bible wrote it down. And there seem to be good reasons for any discrepancy because there were no written records. And the Exodus story was written at least 250 years later in Hebrew after the events occurred. And implications of this presentation. Suppose archaeological scientists agreed with me that there was an Exodus event, because that really seems to be shown. The mysterious hill country people, all of them had an extraordinary event of freedom from Egyptian oppression, whether it was in the Delta or in Canaan. What would the implication, and if a significant percentage of Christian believers and Jewish believers agreed, what would change for Christian clergy and deacons or rabbis and Jewish leaders? And my suggestion is nothing. You're not going to try to teach this to your Bible class, I don't think. Partly because you can't say, well, what really happened was, and you don't know. And partly because our job is to teach the Bible. And so anyway, I don't see this as being something that's going to affect your day-to-day preaching and teaching. Now, you can argue with me on that, but that would be my implication. Possible dialogue with non-believers. Now, this is significant. The possibility of dialogue with atheists and agnostics and skeptics. Because then you can start from the same set of facts, right? There would be agreement on those 6 conclusions of archaeology. And then you can have a discussion about, was this guided by a higher power or was it totally accidental? But if you're starting from a single set of facts, that makes a big difference. What would happen, I don't know, I'm not really talking about evangelism, I'm talking about dialogue, but dialogue becomes much more possible, I think. And the third thing is teaching in schools and colleges, because if the Exodus, as I have presented it, is viewed as a scientific fact, it becomes teachable in schools and colleges, even in public schools. They should not teach religion, but they can certainly teach about religion. And they probably should be doing a lot more, in my opinion, teaching about all the 5 major religions to public schools, but that's an opinion. So those are my thoughts, and the floor is open for all questions. For statistics on the population of Canaanites, Philistines, and hill country people, and for a huge amount of other information, for the alphabet, for the collapse of civilizations beginning about 1200 BC, for the cultural differences between Canaanites, Philistines, and hill country people, also his 2018 paper on pigs in space and time, for the discovery of the hill country people in the 1970s.